Welcome to the webinar, The Path from Overwhelm and Stress to Calm and Confidence. I'm Dr. Dawn Kingston, and I'm the host of this webinar today. I'd like to start with an introduction that speaks about where the information in this webinar comes from. It has come from years of our working with women, researching women's needs, building supports for women's emotional health, and supporting women's leaders. And recently we compiled this information in a course as well, which you can access at the link that you'll see on the screen, because many women identified that they wanted more support dealing with overwhelm and stress. By the end of our time together, you'll identify why most attempts at dealing with overwhelm and stress fail, so that you can start to make the shift from feeling overwhelmed, believing that you are shortchanging everyone and everything, and feeling guilty that you can't make anyone happy, including yourself. Does that resonate? I'd invite you to turn everything off. Give yourself this gift of time. You're in the right place. If you can identify with any of these things, you're tired of living with overwhelm and stress, and you don't know how to escape, you're in the right place if your overwhelm and stress is affecting the relationships with those you care most deeply about. If you can't seem to rise above the exhaustion, tension, worry, and guilt that goes along with the overwhelm and stress. I've been there. I'm a university professor, researcher, nurse, executive coach, director of a leadership institute, and yes, a mother and a wife as well. I have 2 grown children and a husband of over 30 years. But all of this together means that I too have struggled with the pain of overwhelm and stress. For the past 17 years, I've researched and cared for women in emotional distress, and I've been driven to help women thrive in the work that we've done. But our work has taken a turn over the past few years, and this is a large part of why I want to share this information with you through this webinar. We've discovered more and more women speaking about perfectionism, guilt, low confidence, and the need to feel that they must meet others' expectations. And I've been there, but so have over 23,000 other women. We found, when we asked a group of 23,000 women, that 75% of those who answered named overwhelm and stress as their number one problem. And the other thing we found is that these 4 pieces, perfectionism, guilt, low confidence, and trying to meet others' expectations, were huge drivers of overwhelm and stress. These are topics that are on many women's minds. We found this was true in women of all ages and stages, young women, experienced women, new mothers, career professionals. 70% told us that what they'd rather have is calm and confidence. And that's how this course was born. Can you imagine not being in overwhelm and stress? What would you rather be? Give yourself freedom to ask that question. And if you've got a piece of paper nearby, jot your answer down. So while 75% of women said that their number one problem was being overwhelmed and stressed, 25% didn't identify that as an issue. Those were the women that we wanted to know, what are you doing differently? We've discovered that the main reason that our attempts to escape overwhelm and stress fail is because we're trying to dig ourselves out of overwhelm by changing our schedules, by taking away a few things, giving ourselves a little bit more of a break. But most of our overwhelm and stress starts with internal drivers. And until we change our internal drivers, those internal messages, we'll never escape overwhelm and stress in our lives. This is what a cycle of overdrive, stress, and overwhelm looks like. We get into overwhelm and stress because we're driven. There are internal drivers and there are external drivers. They kick us into this frantic pace where we feel like we have no margin and no space. That leads us into stress, and long-term stress leads us into a chronic stress state that we've called overwhelm. What I haven't got on this diagram is that overwhelm, overdrive, and stress, that continuous cycle, can lead us into burnout. And burnout is a significant health issue. It has physical and emotional consequences, and it can take weeks and months to get out of. So we don't want to end up getting into this cycle into burnout. You can't escape overwhelm and stress only by taking a few things out of your schedule, having your partner unload the dishwasher, or adding exercise to your morning routine. These are all good strategies. They're just not enough. There is a mindset of overwhelm, a mindset that keeps us trapped in this cycle. This is what we've identified. That mindset is about being driven to please others, worrying about not meeting others' expectations, having a very real fear of not looking like a good mom, a good employee, a good friend. This mindset is also about believing that we can never let down, that we worry that others think we're not good enough. And much of this makes us end up feeling guilty. It's also about not being sure of ourselves. And we end up being vigilant, second guessing. I call it like a dance. We're dancing with other people, trying to figure out what they want from us and what they expect from us. And all of that ends up culminating in this need to comply, this need to do what others want us to do. But these are the very things that continually kick us into overdrive. Is it any wonder then that just changing a schedule doesn't do it for us? Plus, this mindset of overwhelm makes our brains light up, and not in a good way. Each of these things turns our brain into a threat detector. We identify threats in our environment. We think that what we're facing is a threat because we see it as a threat. And our brains then turn on our stress response, which leads us into a whole physical experience of stress. But I want to be clear, because being overwhelmed is not the same thing as being busy. It's being busy doing the wrong things. And this is something that we delve into in a lot of depth in the course that I shared with you. So there are 4 beginning steps that you can use to start to crawl out of overwhelm and stress. And I'll touch on each one of them in the balance of this webinar. Know where you're at. Know where you want to be. Know your drivers of overwhelm and stress. And know your vital few. These are beginning steps that we teach in the course and that I use when I'm coaching women as well. These steps can start to give you clarity, self-awareness, and direction on how to make significant steps out of overwhelm and stress. They are the basis of sustainable, long-term change, and that's important because that cycle of overwhelm that we talked about means that we're constantly cycling between dumping things off our schedule, adding things back in, getting back into overwhelm. And every time we do that cycle, it chips away at our confidence to be able to get out of escape overwhelm and stress. So let's start with the first foundation, know where you're at. I love this quote by Stephen Covey, who's a leadership expert and author. He's passed away now. But he said self-awareness involves deep personal honesty. It comes from asking and answering the hard questions. And I'm going to walk you through a few of those hard questions this morning. But the goal is really for you to gain that kind of self-awareness. What is self-awareness? I love Stephen Covey's other comment. It's our capacity to stand apart from ourselves and examine our thinking, our motives, our history, our scripts, our actions, and our habits and our tendencies. So it's our ability to stand back from ourselves and examine how we're doing. Much of the time when we're in overwhelm and stress, we don't give ourselves that ability to stand apart, but we'll never make a start if we don't. In many ways, self-awareness is like that aha moment. It's that moment when you learn something fresh and new about yourself, something that will change the trajectory of your direction going forward. So here are 4 questions that you can use to start your self-awareness journey. These 4 questions are areas that lead us into overwhelm, overdrive, and stress. I've given you a sample of 4 in this webinar just to keep time tight, but in the course that I've spoken about, there are 17 areas that have been identified as key contributors to overwhelm and stress. But let's start with the first one. You'll see it's on a continuum from red, alert, to green, which is the healthy end of the spectrum. And we've asked you to identify right now, I am, and then in 1 month, where would you rather be? So answer, right now, I am very stressed and overwhelmed, all the way to very calm and confident. If you could put an X on that continuum, where would you put it? And then in 1 month, where would you want to be? Let's go to the second question. Right now, I don't feel that I have a choice about how my day and my life is going, all the way to I have choice about how my day and my life is going. Choice is a big part of overwhelm and stress. Many times we feel immobilized to get ourselves into a state of learned helplessness where we don't feel like we have choice. So answering honestly, how much choice do you really feel like you have is a good starting point. And then where do you want to be in a month? This question, right now I do, but what I do doesn't have lasting, meaningful value. Or are you closer to the green, healthy end of the scale? I choose to create meaning and value in the things I commit to in my life. Much of the time, overwhelm and stress is because we're busy doing things that aren't important to us, and we're frustrated because we can't get to the things that are. Where do you want to be in a month? The final question, again, 4 out of 17, but the 4th one that we'll talk about today, right now I feel like I'm not doing anything well. Or are you closer to, I'm doing the important things in my life well? Where would you put your X on that continuum? And then again in 1 month, I want to. Where do you want to be? Let's move on to the second step that you can take to start to crawl out of overwhelm and stress. This is that part about knowing your drivers of overwhelm, and stress. Famous rule called the 80-20 rule. It's used in many, many areas now, but that rule is over 150 years old, and it starts back in Italy. There was an Italian economist and a philosopher. His name was Vilfredo Pareto. He came up with this 80-20 rule, and it said that 20% of what we do leads to 80% of any outcome that we achieve. It said that this pattern occurred to him when he discovered that 20% of the pea plants in his garden were producing 80% of his peas. And as he looked for evidence of this rule in other areas, he found that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. But since then, over the last 150 years, this rule has been widely applied and found to hold true for everything from healthcare. For example, 20% of patients use 80% of the resources, to even our personal habits, like 80% of the time I only wear 20% of the shoes. So if we apply that to going forward with overwhelm, overdrive, and stress, 80% of the good things that happen in your life today will come from 20% of your actions. Or 80% of your success comes from 20% of your activities, tasks, and actions. Putting this directly into the context of overwhelm and stress, that rule would say that 80% of your overwhelm and stress comes from only 20% of the things that bother you or create stress for you. We tend to think that all of the things in our lives are drivers, the things, our mindset, experiences, people in our lives, that all those things that stress us out are the things that lead to overwhelm. But that rule would say that it's actually only 20% of our drivers that put us into an overwhelmed, stressed state. That means that not everything you do has equal value or deserves all your time and attention. So the key is to find your 20% most potent drivers. I want to show you a diagram. Forgive me, I'm a researcher. I love diagrams. But that orange square in the middle, overdrive, you can see the yellow bubbles on the left. Relationships, feelings, our mindset, which is our thoughts and attitudes and beliefs, and our situations and circumstances. Some of these things are going to lead us into overdrive, that frantic pace where we feel like we have no margin. And that state leads us to overwhelm and stress. But what I'd invite you to do, and I'll give you a minute in this webinar to do it, what I would invite you to do is take 1 minute and just make a list of all of the things that cause you to kick into overdrive. Again, they can be relationships, feelings, your mindset, situations, and circumstances. The reason I suggest 1 minute is because in that 1 minute, the most important things will tend to bubble up to the surface. Have you got a piece of paper and a pencil or a typewriter, iPad nearby? All right, start now. Here's your 1 minute timer. We're coming up to the end of 1 minute. How did you do? So let me tell you what to do with that list now. Of everything that you listed, find the top 20%. It's just a math thing. If you found 5 things, then only one of those things is your top 20%. If you had 10 things, 2 of them would be in your top 20% of potent drivers of overwhelm and stress. Those are the things that you want to focus your overwhelm escape efforts on. The most you could probably do is 3 things, 30 things. So roughly, probably about 1 to 3 things is what you will come away with as your most important, significant drivers of overwhelm. But let me ask you about those drivers, just to take a step back. How did that make you feel to identify those 1, 2, or 3 significant drivers? And what did you notice about yourself when you discovered that? I'd invite you to take one more step and try this strategy. Ask yourself about those 1, 2, or 3 drivers. What do those drivers tell me about myself? Write it down. And then, what does that driver tell me about? What does that tell me about myself? And write that down. And what does that tell me about myself? And ask that question 3 more times. When you ask yourself this same kind of question 5 times, by the time you reach the 4th and 5th time, you're really digging into the heart of the matter. What does that driver, that thing that puts you into overdrive, overwhelm, and stress, what does that tell you about yourself? What we find is that most, even if the situations or circumstances or relationships are external, what we find is that eventually they become internal drivers. And when you do this exercise, often by the end, you'll come away with this very important internal driver, something that you may not have recognized before about yourself. And that's that aha moment, that self-awareness. I would encourage you to share that piece with a trusted friend or to journal your thoughts about it. These things will help to solidify what you've come to know about yourself, which can provide a huge foundation and a step forward as you work to get out of overwhelm and stress. Overwhelm and overstress. We're at the end of our time together today. I'd love to share more webinars on this topic, so stay tuned. But if you would like more support on managing overwhelm and stress, here is the new course that we've created, really by demand, The Path from Overwhelm and Stress to Calm and Confidence. It's a 6-step system, and the course will walk you through each of the 6 steps so that by the end, you'll have a very clear idea of what puts you into overdrive, what you need to do to get out of it, how to manage your life, what your most important things are, how to build them into your life, etc. You can access the course there at that link. And what I want to mention is because this is the first time this course has been launched, we're offering it to a small group of women at an introductory low cost, and then we'll use your feedback from the comments right inside the course to make the next version even better. So we want to make this available for about the next 3 weeks or so to get a small group of women started in the course. I wish you well and thank you for joining me today.